As you see, some of our guests had to leave earlier to already catch their planes and trains to get home. I, however, wonder whether we could open this forum for you to pose the questions they were preparing the whole day, whole afternoon. And I have a proposition to make.
Simon.
Connecting...
Oh, yes, Simon.
Ah, Simon.
Simon, come here.
You're hiding away. Oh, sorry.
Can we have some
Simon.
more lights for the filming? Otherwise, the internet audience will be falling asleep as well as the one in the room.
And I wonder whether we could try to combine this forum for posing questions to our contributors with some kind of thinking of perhaps a set of propositions in the sense Simon made a sort of list of questions that he believes the trajectory of the research of the Formovas project should engage with. We'd be really interested to hear from you what is it that we, in this zooming in and zooming out in the last 3 days, while trying to figure out how to map this vast territory, what is it that we omitted? What is it that we forgot and we need to remember to look at? So if we could combine these two agendas, being aware this is quite complicated, I'd like to, however, try and encourage you to do so. I wonder, are there now at the onset questions in the audience that you would like to pose? I'll be walking with the mic this way.
Yeah, thank you, Maria. I was asked to introduce myself. My name is Alex de Vries. I'm an independent author, not that independent because I'm a board member of BAC. But looking back on the last 3 days, we talked about two opposites, like former and post, like before and after. And from an art historical point of view, then we look back on both those issues. You know, it's a point in time, '89, and we are talking about before and after. So I think somebody was right here when he said that art history was something like science fiction in hindsight. But we were also talking about not before and after, but also about again, like the word re is coming up all the time, you know, like reenactment and you know, all those re-words we use. And when I look at the word former, then at the end we see two letters, and if we put them backwards, then it's re. I mean, if we put them in front of the word form, then we get reform. And I've got the idea that the whole conference should be about reforming the West in a country that is known for its reformation 450 years ago. That's maybe a good point that we could focus on from now on. Is it true that we have to reform the West? And if so, how to do that then?
Thank you, Alex. Shall we try to collect two more questions, if there are? Questions and comments, please. Feel free. Katja.
So my name is Ekaterina Degat, I'm curator from Moscow. So when I saw the word Congress, it's actually close to the previous question, so it would be easy to answer together. So when I saw the word Congress, I immediately understood that this is not a conference, this is about consolidation of some forces, and we really see here, as far as I understand, the progressive part of the art world, because some of the significant figures which would normally be present at such a Congress are not here, and so we are supposed to feel this solidarity, which I do feel, but this is also a consolidation of the West, and I think it also means that the discourse of Eastern Europe is completely over. So everybody is speaking from the Western position here, and the West itself is, as Eastern Europe was entering the West, and you know that what happened in Berlin in 1989 was not creating some kind of third force or third way as Eastern German dissidents hoped. It was Eastern Germany actually entering the Western Germany. And so East actually finally entered the West, and now West is preparing itself to enter the global entity, maybe in the same way. So my comment was that I feel this conference as 100% Western, which is not bad, but has to be reflected. And I would say in the first place, the idea of art is very Western. Art as professional activity, which is based on modernist style, I would say, and I really feel it being non-Western, being outside it, and existing under conditions of art market and private property. And another point, which is also part of this assumption, and this art being critical. And for me, I think this would be the main point which has to be reflected, and what was not that much present for me is this self-reflection of the West and this critical approach to this critical character, and that's why the most important points for me were the critique of fluid institutions of the so-called independent small institutions, critique of activism, which is also important. And I think this kind of self-reflection is what was lacking for me, and maybe also the sense of humor, which is part of the East and which was not that much present.
Thank you, Katja. Another one while I'm here at this part of the room? Yes.
My name is Luisa Nader. I'm from Warsaw University. And I just would like to follow the last question of Ekaterina Degot and to comment on these 3 days. I had an impression after the first day that the speakers were very successful in disintegrating the identity of the West and questioning the former West. And yesterday I had an impression that the West, not even the former West, but the West itself has a stable and firm identity and that doesn't like to think critically about this identity. And today, again, I kind of gained hope for thinking critically about the West, former West, whatever. And my question, perhaps not to today's speaker, but also maybe to the speakers that are gathered on the stage, would be, can we think about any event outside former West or West or post-West? Can we think about any event in the Badiou sense in regions like Central Europe, Eastern Central Europe, East Russia, that could force former West or West to rewrite its history entirely, to rethink its self-production? So that would be my question, perhaps, to the speakers who were speaking yesterday. But maybe the speakers gathering on the stage could kind of point to the events that could be interesting or eventual for former West curators and art historians. Thank you.
Can I ask you something? Just to clarify, are you talking about a possible future event, or are you thinking more of a historical?
I'm thinking about events in a Badiou sense. So it could be artistic practice or political event or a thought before 1989.
Okay, right.
Can I? There's one more question here, so it will be 4.
My name is Clara Kemp-Welsh. I have a related question to Louisa's, and I've been also quite troubled about some of the things in the last 2 days. And I think particularly this kind of absence from the discussion of the Central European dissident movements. A couple of days ago at the London School of Economics, we had Václav Havel, Bielecki, and a lot of important Central European dissidents and the early politicians who took power after 89, and they were asked to address the question of 20 years on, have our dreams come true? And obviously it was expected by the English audience that everybody would say no, and it's such a disaster because now we have capitalism. And in fact, nobody did admit this at all, apart from Havel, who was the first person to say, yes, there are many things which I did wrong, and the first one was to listen to the economists, so he wouldn't do this again. But I suppose in relation to what Charles Esche said, and a couple of other people who also have kind of completely, I think, ignored the possibility that the dissidents might offer a model which could be useful or applicable to today's situation. I'd like to kind of ask Charles why or how he feels about this failure, which you mentioned, when you asked Douglas, don't you think that perhaps, or did you kind of think that this was a failure in some way? So just to kind of, in relation to Alain Badiou, for whom he quite openly states that for him, 1989 was not an event. For him, it was only the dying of what was already dead, because for him, communism ended in 1968. And Zizek comments on this, I think, very astutely, that for the Western left, the dissidents really betrayed their idea of communism, and they missed the opportunity of the Prague Spring. And this is a very, very hypocritical position, to blame dissidents for failing to invent the third way. And I think there's a danger that, we continue to do this in the West. So I don't know if that's a question.
It is. Who would like to start?
About the question of the reform of the West, and whether that's something that's a desirable outcome.
I don't know if it's possible to have a desirable outcome, but first I want to say again that I enjoyed very much Nuria and Anna's presentation, because in many ways, and I would like to return back to this question, concerning the different possibilities, and I think this is also linked to Sarah's presentation of anti-politics, parallel politics, and civic enthusiasm. That what is beginning to occur, it seems to me, is an obvious tension, between the idea of public space or institution and the idea of civil society or civic. And Piotr raised this question, especially in relation to the question he posed to Anna, which may not have been addressed, completely, and this has to do with the notion of politics and perhaps self-determination, to use Douglas's term, in Latin America. Where are the possible places where we can also learn or sort of take some historical lessons? Lessons, and it seems that when you think in the framework of Latin America and you think about liberation theology and all different forms of dissidency. So my interest is really to look at this larger formation of civil society. Because whether it's in Eastern Europe or Central Europe or South Africa or Latin America, South America, Africa, and so on, I think that we are yet to deal with the complete implications of the catastrophe of Western imperialism, and the shock of that, which is still being lived through. And maybe this may be what Jalal meant yesterday as surpassing disaster. So this catastrophe, cannot just simply be a question of reformation, but more a question of recognition. So we need to really work with the notion of recognition in this sense, because reform and so on, it kind of plays that role of a kind of, sadomasochist relationship, so we tell the West how bad they are, and there's an enjoyment, in that, because it offers the possibility of repentance and still not repent. I mean, so after all these things are done, the institutional sphere still remains. So this question of civil society and the way, it played out in Eastern Europe and other places, for me is a kind of remarkable, important thing that Nuria brought up in relation to Spain. And I think maybe for us it would be important to sort of to distinguish, that sphere of activity and action, different forms of, coalition building, forms of solidarity, from this idea of public space. And as Sarat and I were, talking about this after the end of that session, that has become in fact quite obsolete. Those notions of public space, don't seem to me that any longer viable in sort of describing where these articulations of these laws and so on could happen. So that's really for me one thing I would like to point out. And let me just simply end with one thing. Maybe it's completely off the topic. But just simply to remind ourselves that maybe, that what we are really contending with now is not the aftermath of 89, but still the non-recognition of 79. And so the tension between dissidents and insurgents. So, because the Soviet Union kicked that off by entering Afghanistan, all of this. So world political and historical formation, if we talk about events, take place, in different ways and in different places. So I'm just making an appeal for other kinds of recognition.
I think, coming back to that question, if I might try and answer. I think given the coincidence of the anniversary of 1989, we have spent the last 3 days rather focused on this particular date. And I think in terms of our initial laying out of the former West, there are other dates within the last 20 years, which definitely include the wars of the last, throughout the period really, from the first Gulf War onwards. The wars in the Middle East and in West Asia generally, are certainly included within that trajectory, I think. And I suppose to come back to the question of failure, I think it's not a failure which happens in 89, that's absolutely right. But maybe this is personal also, talking to Douglas brings me back to a time much earlier on, that I certainly in the 80s and in the 70s growing up in a basically communist family, we had a sense of a horizon, and communism, however broken, however obviously dysfunctional, gave a kind of a notion of a horizon. And that horizon, of course, fell away in 1956, in 1968, and constantly fell away throughout that time. But somehow it still, as a speculative horizon, survived. And I think 89, in terms of the West, the loss of that horizon, however distant it was at that point, however lost from view it might be, but nevertheless somehow it conducted an idea, which I think is the idea that Badiou talks about, the communist hypothesis. The communist hypothesis was this horizon. And I think that 89 purely symbolically and in no other way represents the loss of that. And certainly there would be absolutely no reason at all to think that the dissidents, that the attempt to create socialism with a human face or whatever in 1968 in various countries amongst the socialist states, that there should be any blame attached to that. Absolutely not. I think there are definitely, as Sarat pointed out, models of parallel politics or anti-politics which we can learn from that. But I think that in order to apply any of those models, we have to take into account another set of events which have happened post-89. And if anything, maybe this is optimistic, but the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the financial crisis in 2008 might be more related to Prague in 1968 than we know. In other words, that there might be a period of stagnation which follows this movement, of impossibility of moving. But actually it marks a moment where the possibility, if you like, that capitalism with a human face could be realized is finally understood to not be I'm a speculation.
No, I mean, I think, I don't want to just jump in too quickly. I'm by no means suggesting that 89 is not important. And even, but on a symbolic level, on an actual level. I'm not suggesting that at all. It's just really maybe to provoke, to add to your prompt, how to enlarge, this, in a particular space. And in terms of the economy, I think maybe, June of 82 is very important in the sense that when Mexico defaulted on its loan, which then, began this cascade of defaults that went through, Latin America and others, and that and here, the logic of Bretton Woods was supposed to apply to those places, economic shock therapy and so on, liberalization of the economy, the eviction of the state from participation in, different social formations, privatization, all of that. And I think, the backdrop of that was, the oil crisis of the 70s. And I think, so when we're looking at all of these different things, for me, it's, that the horizon, keeps shifting. And maybe the failure of Lehman Brothers is now bringing to bear the fact that the Bretton Woods institutions as constituted in the immediate post-war period have outlived, their usefulness. So we need a new kind of, I think Piotr was mentioning, a kind of global constitution of some sort that really, maybe is a bit more different. And so anyway, so that's why, I'm not in any way saying that 89 is not important, symbolic or otherwise.
Yeah, it's just one footnote. Just one footnote to 1989. I think that, first of all, 1989 has nothing to do with communism, because there's not communism fell down that year. There was something like, I would say, the failure of totalitarian structures of Eastern Bloc in Eastern Europe. But it was at that time, after the martial law was declared in Poland in 1981, at the end of the 1981, so communism, there was the last step of communism, which was nothing to do with ideology, only pure power, military junta, pure power. At the beginning of this failure was even not 68, but 56, the Khrushchev speech in February 1956, that he said, all right, there was so many mistakes. And from 1956, communism just was falling, and for the Western prospect, from the Western intellectual prospect, 68, what was done in Prague, that was, so important. As you said correctly, I completely agree with you that the dissidents movements in the Soviet Union and people who were, fired from their own country to the West, this movement was sort of significant sign that communism is over. So what I'm going to say that 1989 is important from the different point of view, that totalitarian structures in this part of Europe just was over. And what I like to stress even more, there's almost the same time in South America. I'm so interested in South America and also South Africa. It was almost the same time the totalitarian structures, looked like they are over too. So I think if you would like, to stress 1989 as an important date for the whole world, that's not only because of communism, was over in Eastern Europe, but because the much broader countries, much broader geographical areas has been witnessed the same processes, like the failure of totalitarian structure. This is the real beginning. The second one is because the failure of the Eastern Bloc is something like suppress the binary way of thinking. It's not because of the communists, because of the military structures and the political structures. Binary way of thinking. So, and binary way of thinking has a much deeper tradition, and a suppress of the binary way of thinking is somehow connected with a process which also was presented in the West. Let's say the whole scholarship about subject, about the construction of the subject, about the relational geography, about what here in this city Rosie Braidotti wrote at the beginning of the 90s about nomadic subjects, and also Judith Butler. All those things, I think, somehow are connected with the failure of the binary way of thinking, including a structure, a definition of the subject. So this is why I would say that the 89 is important, not only because of the changes in the political, but definitely communism was over that time. But I'd like to refer to the question about the exhibition. There was, I think, Luisa's question about what kind of exhibitions in Eastern Europe, or former Eastern Europe, let's say. What? Events, yeah. Not exhibition, events. Did you mention art events or just the political events? What?
Any event.
Any event. Maybe I'm not prepared to give you the answer of any events, but there are so many events where in Eastern Europe, like the martial law in Poland, like the fall of the Berlin Wall. Doesn't matter, but exhibitions. But we are talking about the art and exhibitions, and unfortunately, I would say that former Eastern Europe lost a chance to do something like this. There was not actually in Eastern Europe, but in Germany, like Europa exhibition, which was really a mistake in terms of revision of these relationships. Instead of deconstruct the whole, there was 1994, I guess. Instead of deconstruction of the whole East-West relations, Richard Stanisławski, quite important curator for East European exhibitions. Unfortunately, he lost an opportunity in this exhibition to construct completely new and revised relationship between East and West. So unfortunately, I would say, in terms of a presence of former East European art on the broader scene, this chance has not been successful. However, I would mention one exhibition which is a sort of approach to this deconstruction, on the global level. This is not in the East, even not in Europe, but the Queen's Museum of Art. I mean, the conceptual, what was the title? Global Conceptuals. For the first time, I saw Anglo-Saxon conceptual art, including both American and British, in the horizontal level. A sort of there was really provincializing Western conceptual art. There were quite global horizontal exhibition, and there was equal. This Anglo-Saxon products was equal to the South American, Asian, African, East European, but Russian and Central European section has been made by Laszlo Beke from Budapest, and Russian, I think, for Margarita Tupitsin, is, if I remember correctly. So there was, in my opinion... Tupitsin. Margarita? Yeah. Margarita Tupitsin. So there was the first attempts, and I noticed, to reschedule the whole geography or something like this, making it horizontally. And that was maybe, important exhibition. Unfortunately, it was not. Not in Eastern Europe.
It could be.
So the question... Oh.
We have a question from the ether, just people that are watching this. It's Lonnie van Prommelen and Siebren Tahan, who are two Dutch artists, and bring up a question I don't think we can address to the panel, but it's one I have to say that's been bothering me enormously over the last couple of days. So I'd like to thank them for it if they can, if they're hearing this. And just if I may read it out. In relation to what someone from the audience Friday was addressing about state funding of critical activities, we were wondering if it could be interesting to reflect upon the context where this conference is taking place. The Netherlands is one of those nations with a notorious colonial past, which is hardly addressed in this country. It is quite telling that Edward Said's landmark publication, Orientalism, published in 1979 originally, of course, was translated into Dutch only in 2003. That's an issue about translation in this country, which is even bigger, I think, than only Orientalism. The lack of awareness about our historical role is also expressed by a statement by the Dutch Prime Minister when he was attacked for his reformist policies maybe, which had increased the gap between rich and poor. He said, "I don't understand why you're so negative and annoyed. Let us just say that the Dutch can do it again, that the VOC, that means the East India Company mentality, we can bring that East India Company mentality back and look beyond the borders." Would it be interesting to think why this debate about the former West takes place in the context of a generous society that is suffering from ignorance? Is that true? Is the generosity of the kind that we're all being, allowing us all to come and meet here, a kind of indulgence? As I say, I don't know whether anybody would like to tackle the question of the Dutch here. But I think that, working here, and Maria probably has something to say as well, I feel it's a really relevant question, and I think we need to address this particular place. I think we've done projects, both of us, and we worked on a project like Becoming Dutch, which was something that was, I felt an attempt to try and address this issue, but it created debate only in the sense that we insulted Zwarte Piet, and that was something that's not allowed to be done in this country, apparently. It's an untouchable Dutch icon. Very troubling untouchable Dutch icon, I would say, but nevertheless one that seems untouchable. What I can say to Lonnie and Siebren is that we agree with them from here, and we will try and address their question in future meetings and conferences. You've worked to some extent here, or have some knowledge of the Dutch situation. I wonder if you have any comments about this.
I think Simon wants to say something.
Sorry, I didn't see you. Simon, I do apologize. I didn't see you. I was focused on trying to answer rather than look around. I apologize.
No, but maybe I think it relates a little bit to this question. I would just maybe say that there's of course, several movements going on in the construction of a new Europe, which we can also call the old Europe. And this is one of the dangers that I think we really have to think about in this idea of the former West. Because one could also say, and I think Ukwi mentioned that a little bit, that what happened with 89 was that Europe could be reunited. And it meant that Europe could once again start thinking of itself as Europe. And it has also meant that then there is no longer an iron curtain through Europe, but there are iron curtains all around Europe. It's the so-called fortress Europe. And these things already started, of course, earlier.
In Europe as well, there is sort of iron curtain, between, let's say, the EU and Serbia, for example.
Yeah, sure. So there are some pockets.
Yeah.
But that's how it's also addressed, I think, in politics in the EU, that these things somehow has to be dealt with. But it's very clear that where the curtain goes, or the fortress goes, and maybe that relates to this question. And I think that's also why that it's. I think it's almost like I have to admit I don't really understand Badiou, so I can't really answer this idea of the event. But it seems to me that it's like a logical impossibility that an event in the former East could make the West change itself and live in another way politically, the way that Badiou writes about it. Because otherwise that would have happened with all these events that had arguably even bigger impact on the Western European countries than what the communists were doing to Eastern Europe, which is the post-colonial liberation movements starting in India and onwards. And with France, it's the symbolic date would maybe be Algeria. That had a much bigger impact on the national.
Here would be Indonesia, of course. Which is,
than what happened in. That's why it was also for the Allied forces after the Second World War. It was okay. Russia can have its sphere of interest there. What they didn't know was that they were actually going to lose their real economic base in terms of the colonies. That was happening at the same time. So maybe those are the questions that needs to be addressed if one is not, when calling something the former East and the former West, we should not make it into a new construction of the old Europe or Europeanness or something.
I think it's also a little difficult to suppose that people in the West could imagine an event in retrospect of time because you didn't know exactly what those hidden histories are. There's clearly a lot of hidden history in the West, and particularly in the East, that we don't know about yet, that we in the West don't know about yet, but that could be uncovered at any point in the future. And there may be events that we just don't know about, or movements that were completely suppressed, that never got to breathe even in their own country, that of course we can't tell what those events might be that could allow us to rethink history. The other thing which I think is important, we're using language like walls and fortresses, and my very bleak take on the situation is that what happened in 1989 was merely the cessation of power from one basic royal family to another one. Same old shit. Basically a cessation of power which allowed the basic machinery of suppression to join up with another one and keep people down just a little bit more. Just like the good old days.
And I think that also chimes maybe just very quickly to remind us of the map that Paul Gilroy showed at the very first day when he was talking about the resurgent West. It actually included Jordan in it, which was quite interesting. But it was everywhere from Latvia to certainly to Poland, and defined in a way what could be seen as a West, a resurgent West, which extends to the whole of Europe, which is what Simon's comment was describing, I think.
Nuria, I think you wanted to comment.
Yeah, I think I wanted to bring up again the question of. The question of the people who are coming to Europe, the migrants, because also I would not agree so much with Okwi when he said that Islam is invisible. I think it's it's more and more visible, and it's impossible to think Europe without Islam because we have a lot of European, which are Muslim. Which are indeed in this religion. I'm not a religious person, so for me it's difficult to. But I think also for all the geopolitics and for Europe, for all Europe, 2001 was really a change of paradigm. And then, as it was said, I don't remember who said. But finally, Eastern European, Eastern Europe was Europe, but now we face another complete different and unknown, and so it's again, how to deal with the other, but with the real other, because it's a question of, as I said, for Spain, it's a question of inequalities. We cannot live with inequality. We can live with difference, but with this folkloric difference that we are putting the communities, we are folklorizing the communities because they are, of course, they are dangerous. So how to, and I think in this sense we were all, we all failed in the art world to deal with this in a not, I mean, in a really emancipating way, or in a really so it was just to maybe for next congresses, or I think we have to really take care of this.
There are more questions.
Just one footnote. I'm sorry, Maria, to 1989, because only once someone, at least today, mentioned Tiananmen Square in Beijing. I think that is so important for the West, particularly for the West, not only for China, but for the West, because there was the beginning of the end of neoliberal way of thinking. Because in Eastern Europe, when we've been expecting free market economy, we were so stupid, and we were thinking that it brings democracy at the same time. But 1989 in China, after 1989 in China, we know that the free market has nothing to do with democracy. Even before 78, so changes began in China. Up to 89, people in China and people outside China could think that economical reforms, some introduction of free market could bring a sort of democracy or free speech, something like this. After 89, no, this is over. So this is, if we are talking about the former West, right? So we have to learn, after China, what happened in terms of the relationship between democracy and free market. So I think this is so important for, particularly right now, when we are facing a failure of neoliberal way of thinking and economy. So we're coming back to the state economy in the West. Many economists are talking about this. So this is 1989. So this is another point of reference in terms of what really changed at that time.
Can I? Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Okay. Again, I have the microphone, so I get to ask the question. My name is Jiminy Hignett, and in fact, it's been somewhat addressed by two of the questions just before this, or speakers. But it's coming back to this business of not former West, but resurgent West, which was mentioned particularly on Thursday by Paul Gilroy, and the question of Islam, which was brought up again by Okwi today. And just now, Nuria said the Islam is no longer invisible, but I have the sense that the Islam is invisible on this stage to some extent, and Charles asked for suggestions for the future editions, and I'd like to suggest that if we are the resurgent West and Islam is the new East, then perhaps we should have some Muslim speakers on the stage next edition. That's all.
Can I say something there? Yeah, I just wanted to make a very small note that I think what is dangerous here is the way in which, in which you are referring to they as being dangerous. I mean, this is what is actually dangerous.
Well, it's a problem of my English. It's always the same. I mean, we are dangerous for them. We are the first dangerous. I mean, it's really my English. I cannot explain, but it's not that. It's how to. I mean, how it is possible to create a common ground for living together in Europe with people who are Europeans. I feel they are the same as me. Me, that I'm not, of course, I'm not a person who thinks in. It was also brought up about tradition. I mean, I think it's important to, and I think what I said, of course. I mean, I think one of the problems, and not only, I mean, of all my migrants, is the invisibility. And we talked last week in other. When I said that I don't agree with the invisibilities, that I think there is an attempt really to make visible that Europe is not homogeneous anymore, and homogeneous. And we don't have an origin which. So this is what I wanted to say.
Thank you. Is there a question?
Yes,
Oh, sorry.
No, thank you, Nuria. I just simply wanted to remind ourselves about the fact that when we speak about the resurgent West, we shouldn't really fall into the trap of thinking that this resurgence is happening from the classical West. The resurgence of the West today is happening from all quarters of the world. So in a sense, we should be thinking of the everywhereness of the West. The West is in the West, but it's everywhere. And that's the situation we face today. It's not as in classical colonialism that the West is entering as the dominant power in other parts of the world. It might want to retreat into things like the fortress Europe and so on, but these are already, to some extent, obsolete strategies of closing the doors, because what is happening is, firstly, in the way I closed my own talk, was to say that China positions itself as the former West to be, and we shouldn't underestimate that ambition. We shouldn't estimate the fact that countries like China, Korea, and India are today buying land in Africa, in South America, vast tracts of land in Argentina and Uruguay and Paraguay, large tracts of land in Africa. The Chinese are buying all sorts of mineral resources in Africa. So there are all sorts of projects which are repeating the ground of Western dominance, except that this West is really just a masquerade. The person behind the mask is absolutely from the East or the South or whatever you'd want to put it. So let's not forget the complexity of the situation we face and think the contemporary and think the notion of the West, not just in terms of this anti-West, in terms of the classical West, but the contemporary West, which is, as I say, ubiquitous everywhere.
Thank you, Sarat. There's one more common question.
Olga Brychovecka, I'm from Kiev, and I have a question to Piotr Petrovsky. You made a point in your talk that there should be move from post-colonial to post-totalitarian perspective. And I don't like the word post-colonial myself. I don't like it because it has too close association with postmodernism. And I would actually argue that the shift from anti-colonialism to post-colonialism, which was made with the help of the myth of postmodern condition, resulted in a situation where a lot of power relations were made invisible, not absent but invisible. So let's not talk about post-colonialism, but talk about some form of critical reflection on the colonial situation, on colonialism. And this type of critical reflection should, of course, consider colonialism as a form of, or particular form of power relations, and imply some resistant practices. So my question is finally, don't you think that post-totalitarian and post-colonial, or this, whatever we would call it, are not the two alternatives, but the questions that cannot be separated from each other? And just very small, very short and direct question, and I really hope you will give me a direct and small answer to this. Do you really think that there is something like provincialization of the West going on? Because I didn't get this from your speech.
Provincialization of the West.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. from the end. I would expect, this is the second meeting that I'm participating in the whole project, the former West, and I would say that if we are able to talk about provincializing the West, that I would really believe that we are in the former West. So this is the answer. So I'm not sure that the West is provincialized, but somehow maybe these processes are going towards this end. And particularly important are the real Western institutions like museums, among others, of course. But that was so. If I see, let's say, in the permanent exhibition, in some leading universal savvy museums like Metropolitan Museum in New York, National Gallery, Washington, D.C., or the same National Gallery in London, or Prado, for example, or Hermitage in St. Petersburg, the permanent exhibition where not the canonic art should be at the center, but it would be in the context of the others art, the other provinces, that I would get that idea that we are in the former West or provincialized West. So this is the second question. The first question is much more complex, of course. Well, I would basically agree with you, but it depends on which area of former totalitarian countries we are talking about. Ukraine is in a very particular situation because of very complex history from both sides, Poland and Russia. And both countries were the colonizers of Ukraine. And culturally speaking, in terms of cultural production, particularly Russian literature, if we read such a book as Eva Thompson's book, who is professor of Slavic languages somewhere in Texas, I think, Austin, Texas, or something like this. And she wrote a book about Russian great literature, like Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and so on, tracing cliches of colonialism, which was, of course, somehow polemical to the American Russian studies. And I think it's quite interesting to trace and to investigate some provinces of the former, 19th century, basically, 19th century empire through culture production. And in terms of this, I would say yes. This post-colonial studies, or colonial and post-colonial studies somehow are important to do this. But in terms of, let's say, the other culture situation in Central Europe, like Hungary, for example, right? This is not so much, useful. So that depends on which particular region of the former Russian and then Soviet colonial structure we are talking about. But somehow I would agree with you that to some extent those kind of vocabulary and rhetoric and also concepts could be, useful.
Thank you, Piotr. I'd like to look at this side of the room and ask, do you have any comments before we close this discussion down? Any question that you would like to ask of one another here on the stage? No. Charles, do you have a question?
We had enough, maybe.
Shall we try to wrap this...
Next Congress. Yeah.
He's going to tell us all about the next Congress in a minute.
Shall we try to wrap this up a little bit, which is an enormous and probably impossible task, but well, perhaps if I said in the beginning 2.5, 3 days ago that I was humbled by the task before us to fulfill the ambition of this project to become a space of thinking, I feel humbled even more now by the task of looking at this gigantic volume of knowledge, questions, comments, complaints, and excitements that we need to deal with further, and we will. I just wanted to tell you a little bit, as you know, it's the first Former West Congress. And with that we would like to indicate that it's really just a starting point, and the ambition we had with this first Former West Congress was basically to begin some sort of mapping, some sort of zooming in and zooming out into things, issues, questions, problems we find extraordinarily important to tackle before we can declare the West being former. We are at the very beginning of the entire process. It feels to me that we constantly are locked into this kind of obligation to make a double move constantly. On one hand, mapping and analyzing certain issues such as exhibitions, artistic practices, institutions, discourses, art market, etc., etc. But at the same time try to speculate about what happens if you look at this mass of information and knowledge through this prism of Former West. If you look at 24-hour psycho piece through this prism, through this filter, Former West, is it another piece than we thought it was? And I think that's a question that we're trying to ask ourselves throughout the project. A congress like this one can only do so much, but the entire research activity is quite big. There are a number of seminars, conferences, and workshops that have already taken place or will take place soon. One at Van Abbe Museum in March in Warsaw, in the Museum of Modern Art, about various issues. One in Reina Sofia in Madrid, tackling questions such as the end of avant-garde and the loss of the horizon. Or history of exhibitions with After All in London. A number of research exhibitions, as we call them. One upcoming with Lawrence Wiener, who is with us trying to analyze this notion of Former West from his own perspective. Or exhibition on the notion of horizon that Simon Scheik will curate in autumn next year. But we have also conducted already a huge number of interviews where we try to speak as much as possible with as many as possible artists to try to figure out what their recollection of this period is. And we did speak to people like Farid, for example, trying to understand various points of view. There are study groups within the Utrecht University, there are various publications and smaller exhibitions upcoming. Very important tool that we created for ourselves is a digital platform where we try which we try to envision as a sort of digital living archive to trace our move while researching the subject of Former West. And so will this conference, as of somewhere mid next week, appear on the digital archive. The recordings of it, I would like to point out the two guys who accompanied us from City TV for 3 days, who will upload all these conversations and lectures, plus papers that have been delivered. We would like to also post here so that you have an opportunity to return to them and read through them again. We would like to, by the year 2013, we would like to have 4 more congresses. So we would like to go to various cities around the world and try to focus on particular issues that would help us understand this process of West becoming formal. If I said I feel it's too early to draw any conclusions from these 3 days, There are a few things I would, however, like to mention. Former West is clearly a citation of former East, and it seems, and it's obvious through our conversation, that it's extremely tempting to reduce this notion of former West to the conflict between the East, so-called East, and so-called West in Europe. For if 1989, I want to insist, however, that it remains our starting point, however symbolically. I would want to count it among our responsibilities to globalize this moment, to ensure that we surpass this potential limitation of looking only at the relationship between East and West. As it must be clear, it is global histories, one of those terms that we repeatedly use last 3 days. Global histories of the contemporary, perhaps, with all the difficulties that this language entails, that we need to deal with. Former West as a term and as potential political realities, of course, up there for negotiation. It's up there as to what its definition might be. But if I should choose between a number of designations offered to it during this Congress, I think we want to think of this not as a diagnosis of our current condition, but rather as an analytical tool to apply to our history of the present, to help us understand the space of art in the world that could potentially help us to imagine it otherwise, as we declare in the beginning of the Congress. If I may, I would like to use this opportunity to applaud all of you for this extraordinary, generous atmosphere, immense generosity and criticality addressing our concerns about this notion of former West. And actually accommodating, using this space of the Congress as an opportunity to come together and perhaps even, as we discussed with some of the contribution, as a space of action. Thank you so very much for your contribution. Thank you, everybody helping us arranging this, and my compliments to a wonderful BAC team. You've been really fantastic. Thank you so very much. And I do really hope we meet in a year's time, somewhere in the world, to make yet another step in understanding where we are in the world that we could call possibly, hopefully, in some understandable way to the rest of the world, former West. Thank you so very much. Thank you.
I want to raise a question.